All right, well, we're going to start off with a little history lesson this morning. I know that's exciting to most of you. Let's look at these two folks here. This is John Alden, and this is his wife, Priscilla Mullins. All right, now John and Priscilla came over on the Mayflower, and you may know the story. The captain of the Mayflower was Miles Standish, and Miles had this thing for Priscilla. Really liked her. And he's a little shy, though. So he sent Mr. John Alden to say, hey, ask her if she's interested in me. I sure would like to marry her. And so John Alden goes and talks to Priscilla. And Priscilla basically says, John, speak for yourself. And so John does and says, well, you know, I got a thing for you, too, and I think I'd like to marry you. And sure enough, they got married. Now, the captain, he probably wasn't too happy at the time. They still remain friends. Here's the thing. John Alden is my 16th great-grandfather. Okay? So I come from a long line of connivers and sneaky people. Okay? Just letting that be known up front. You know, every time I preach, I tell a little bit more about myself that you don't want to know. So anyway, you know, we do. We get a lot of things from our parents and even from prior generations. Some of it's genetic, like our physical characteristics, but also parents can contribute to a kid's mental, their emotional, and their spiritual development as well. And even parents can even help their kids in physical abilities. Like I think if Archie Manning had gone into accounting instead of football, would Eli and Peyton have become Super Bowl winners? I don't know. I don't think so. You know, so we can contribute even to physical abilities. And it's pretty evident, too, I think, we know that a child can pick up a parent's negative habits as well. I'll give you some statistics here up on the screen that we're pretty familiar with. Kids of alcoholics are 4 times more likely to abuse alcohol. Children of drug addicts, 8 times more likely to become drug addicts. And kids who experience child abuse and neglect are 59% more likely to be arrested as a juvenile, 28% more likely to be arrested as an adult, and 30% more likely to commit violent crimes. So those are statistics that, you know, we may not know those exact numbers, but we're aware that those negative things can happen as well. And sometimes a parent can pass down something even when they know it's wrong. I'll give you an example here. This picture here is of Julie Gladden. Now, when she was going to church here, we knew her as Julie Poss growing up here. Let's go back to that picture. Yeah, look at her for a little bit. Now, if we see her middle name there, how would you pronounce that middle name? I'm hearing some correct and incorrect. You look at it and you'd think that's Joan, okay? Actually, her name is Julie Joanne. And what happened was Julie's great-grandmother, I don't know how many years ago that was, but when she had Julie's grandmother, the great-grandmother wasn't too good of a speller. So she labeled the grandmother as Peggy Joanne, but spelled it Joan. Peggy has Elizabeth. Elizabeth Joanne, Joan. Continues on. And so every time Julie's going to school, you know how they do the first day, they call out the name Julie Joan. No, it's Joanne. You always have to correct because they've intentionally passed down this name that's spelled a little bit differently. So it's true. Much of what parents do, the way they talk, their abilities, their lifestyles, their behaviors, all this stuff, can influence children for generations, for the better or for the worse. Now, when we hear about families where there's a drug or alcohol problem, where there's abusive or emotional distant parents, neglected kids, or keeping secrets and telling lies is just a way of life, we have a term for that. It's called a dysfunctional family. And dysfunction as well can be passed down from generation to generation just as easily as passing down a physical characteristic. Because, and we'll see this, hopefully see this today, that what one generation tolerates, the next generation embraces. What one generation tolerates, the next one embraces. And I think those of us who have been around for a while have seen that. What we kind of tolerated 20, 30, 40 years ago is now embraced, and it'll just keep sliding down that way. But you see, dysfunction in families is nothing new. In fact, the Bible's full of dysfunctional families. Our students on Sunday morning, they're learning about some of those families, and I'll just give you one example here of King David. I think a lot of us know this story about David. He had an affair with his married next-door neighbor, and she became pregnant as a result of that. He had the husband killed. Later on, he's got another son named Ammon. Ammon turns out to be a rapist. Another son, Absalom, turns against his dad and wants to take over the kingdom. And so this is just one example of a fine, outstanding biblical family that we have. In fact, what's he known as? He's known as a man after God's own heart. But he's got a lot of dysfunction in his family. So today we're going to be looking at 4 generations of one particular dysfunctional family in the Bible. We're going to start in Genesis 12, and if you look on your bulletin outline there, you'll see that we'll be in Genesis 12 through 50. Now, we're not going to stay here for 3 days as we read all that. We're going to hit some highlights of some of these folks as we go through. Now, in Genesis 12, we have the story of a man who's known as the father of the Jews. And as you look at that chart in your bulletin, you'll see that we're talking about Abraham. Of course, before he was named Abraham, he was named Abram, and his wife Sarah before was named Sarai. So I kind of use those their two names interchangeably. In the first 9 verses of Genesis 12, we see that God has called Abraham to go into a land which I'm going to show you. And so Abraham follows God's call. He goes into the land, and God says, I'm going to be with your descendants in this land. Abraham builds an altar, worships God. Everything's cool. Now let's read verses 10 through 20 of Genesis 12. And as you look there at the chart, you'll see the verses that we're going to be looking at there as we go through here. So Genesis 12, verses 10 through 20. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. And as he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, now I know what a beautiful woman you are. That's what a lady always loves to hear. I know what a beautiful woman you are, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I'll be treated well for your sake and my life, and my life will be spared because of you. So when Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarai was a very beautiful woman, and when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. And she was taken into his palace, and he treated Abram well for her sake. And Abram acquired sheep, cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, camels. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife, Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. What have you done to me? He said. Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister? So that I took her to be my wife. Now here's your wife. Take her and go. And Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had. So as we look at this, we see that Abram's descendants are going to be promised the land. All right. And he doesn't have any descendants left. They go to Egypt, and instead of relying on God, that God's going to trust, or trusting God that he's going to protect him, he takes matters into his own hands. And what he does is he tells this half-truth to protect himself. So that's his action. Abraham's action is he tells a half-truth. And a half-truth, as I think we know, is a technically true statement, but it's meant to deceive, to get around the real question. So if a student is caught cheating on a test and mom or dad says, hey, did you cheat on that test? And the student says, well, I promise, I did not look on my neighbor's paper. See, that didn't answer the question because the notes are written on the hand, right? That's it. It's technically true, but it's meant to deceive. But here in Abraham's story, we see this story that he told to the Egyptians, and you think, well, isn't it just an outright lie? That's where we get on down to Genesis chapter 20. Okay, we go to Genesis chapter 20. We see the same scenario played out, but just a little more detail is given to us. So we're going to look at a few verses here in Genesis 20, the first 3 verses, and then 8 through 12. It says, now Abraham moved on from there to the region of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. And for a while he stayed in Gerar, and Abraham said of his wife Sarah, she is my sister. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent Sarah and took her. But God came to Abimelech in a dream one night and said to him, you are as good as dead because of the woman you have taken. She is a married woman. Let's look on down in verses 8 through 12. The next morning, Abimelech summoned all of his officials, and when he told them what had happened, they were very much afraid. And Abimelech called Abraham in and said, what have you done to us? How have I wronged you that you have brought such great guilt upon me and my kingdom? You have done things to me that should never be done. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what's your reason for doing this? And Abraham replied, I said to myself, this is surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not of my mother. She became my wife. So technically, she's the half-sister. She's a half-sister. So he told this half-truth in order to protect himself. He told this half-truth in order to protect himself. And we're going to see as this generational sin keeps following down the line. Abraham and Sarah have Isaac. Isaac marries Rebekah. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to Isaac. So let's look at his son Isaac and see how the sins of his father Abram affected him. So we're going to look in Genesis 26 and look at a few verses there, 6 through 9. So Isaac stayed in Gerar. And when the men of that place asked him about his wife, he said, what? She is my sister. Because he was afraid to say, she is my wife. He thought the men of this place might kill me on account of Rebekah because she is beautiful. When Isaac had been there a long time, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked down from a window and saw Isaac caressing his wife, Rebekah. And Abimelech summoned Isaac and said, she is really your wife. Why did you say to me, she is my sister? Isaac answered him, because I thought I might lose my life on account of her. So we've got Daddy Abraham, tells a half-truth, protect himself, and just like father, like son, this time it's an outright lie. Isaac lies, tells an outright lie to protect himself. But the generational sin doesn't stop there. It keeps going on down the line. Now we're looking at Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac grows up, marries Rebekah. They have twin boys. And we looked at this story in detail this past Wednesday night. They have twin boys, Jacob and Esau. Esau's the older just by a few minutes. They're twins. Esau is an outdoorsy guy. He's a skilled hunter, and he's very hairy. Okay, he's daddy's favorite. Jacob, on the other hand, he's the younger, he's the quieter. In fact, the Bible says he dwelled in the tents instead of being an outside guy. He's mama's favorite. And so in that culture, the older brother, even if you're older by just a few minutes, you're entitled to what's called the birthright. What's the birthright? Well, that's a double portion of the inheritance. There's a special ceremonial blessing that daddy gives you. And one day, Esau comes in from the field, and he's tired, he's famished, and Jacob's cooking some stew. You know, he's inside the tent, he's cooking stew. Esau says, hey, give me some of that stew. Jacob, being the cunning guy he is, says, well, sell me your birthright. And Esau says, well, what good's my birthright if I'm going to die of hunger? Yeah, okay, let's make the swap. So the trade's made. Sold his birthright for a bowl of soup, basically. So later, years later, Isaac's about to die. His eyesight's really bad. And he told Esau, go out, hunt some game, fix me some food, and come in here, and I'm going to give you this final blessing on your life before I die. So Esau takes off to go do this, but Mama overhears this story. And so she goes, Jacob, come here. We're going to trick Daddy. And so prepares some food, takes some of Esau's clothes and puts on Jacob, even takes some animal skins and puts on his hands and arms and on the back of his neck. So maybe his eyesight's pretty bad. And so that's where we get to Genesis 27, starting in verse 29. Jacob, all dressed up with the hairy arms and all this now, says to his father, I am Esau, your firstborn. There's lie number one. I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Please sit up and eat some of my game so that you may give me your blessing. And Isaac asked his son, how did you find it so quickly, my son? The Lord your God gave me success, he replied. That's a good church answer, isn't it? God was helping me here. Then Isaac said to Jacob, come near so I can touch you, my son, to know whether you are really my son Esau or not. Jacob went close to his father Isaac, who touched him and said, the voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. He did not recognize him, for his hands were hairy like those of his brother Esau, so he proceeded to bless him. Are you really my son Esau, he asked. Here comes another lie. I am, he replied. Then he said, my son, bring me some of your game to eat so that I may give you my blessing. So Jacob brought it to him, and he ate, and he brought some wine, and he drank, and his father Isaac said to him, come here, my son, and kiss me. So he went to him and kissed him, and when Isaac caught the smell of his clothes, I mean, he's got Esau's clothes on. Smells like Esau, the outdoor sweaty guy. He blessed him and said, the smell of my son is like the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you heaven's dew and earth's richness, an abundance of grain and new wine. May nations serve you and peoples bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may the sons of your mother bow down to you. May those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed. Wow. So let's think about this generational sin so far. We've got Abraham tells a half-truth to protect himself. The next one down the line, Isaac tells an outright lie to protect himself. And then we get down here to Jacob, and he lied to his father. He lied to his father. Now, before, we're lying to other people. Now we're lying to a relative. We're lying to our father, lying to his father, both by what he said and by what he did, to benefit himself. Well, first it was to protect self, and now it just keeps sliding down the slope. And I'm lying to my relatives just for my own benefit. That's what he's doing. Now, it's interesting here. Jacob lives up to his name. You may have a footnote or something in your Bible that Jacob's name actually means cheater or deceiver. And so, and just in this exchange, he lied multiple times. There again, we'll tell a little bit on myself. You may have heard this before, but James is the Greek, and James, of course, is my legal name, Jim. James is the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew name Jacob. So not only do I come from a long line of cheaters and deceivers and all that, that's my name as well. So there you go. All right. So remember what we stated earlier. What one generation tolerates, the next generation embraces. So that's 3 generations. Now let's look at number 4. All right. Jacob, the deceiver, has 12 sons. But just like he was mama's favorite, he has his own favorite son. And that's Joseph. And you've probably heard Joseph in the Coat of Many Colors, or maybe you've seen the play, Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. That's the guy we're talking about here. Joseph's brothers, his half-brothers, despised him, hated him, because Joseph was the favorite. And Joseph didn't do much to help the situation either, because he would tell his brothers how he dreamed that one day they were going to serve him. And so, that just doesn't set too well. And so they were jealous, and they wanted to kill him. But one brother spoke up and said, no, let's don't kill him. Let's just sell him into slavery. Well, okay, whatever. So they sold him into slavery. At least they made some money out of it, I guess. And they took that precious coat of many colors. They took a goat and killed it and smeared goat blood on it. And then they go back to Daddy, and they say, Daddy, some wild animal's gotten a hold of Joseph, and this is all that's left, is this wonderful coat that's all smeared with blood. So as we look at that 4th generation, we see Joseph's brothers sold their own brother and lied to their father just out of jealousy. Okay, they weren't even benefiting themselves at all. It was just out of jealousy. Fortunately, that's not the end of the story, all right? Joseph is taken down to Egypt as a slave, and he eventually becomes the overseer of the captain of the Egyptian guard. His name's Potiphar. However, Potiphar's wife relentlessly tries to seduce Joseph, but Joseph wouldn't give in. And so finally she just says, well, enough of this. I'm just going to blame him. So she cries attempted rape, and he goes off to prison. So he's a victim of another lie here as well. So while he's in prison, he works his way up kind of in the prison system to kind of what we would call a trustee. He's over other prisoners, and he has this gift of interpreting dreams. And he interprets dreams of a couple of Pharaoh's workers who were also in prison at the time. And one of those is the cupbearer. And to the cupbearer, he said, hey, when you're released from prison, mention me to Pharaoh, because mention what a good guy I am, and maybe I'll get out of here. Cupbearer gets released and promptly forgets that little promise that he made. So Joseph now is the victim of the jealous brothers, the victim of a lying woman, and now this unkept promise. But 2 years later, Pharaoh himself is troubled by some dreams. And nobody in the palace or whatever can interpret this. And then it's at that point the cupbearer remembers, there's that guy in prison, Joseph. I remember him. And so Pharaoh calls him up from jail. And actually, he called him up from the pit. It said, this wasn't our nice sanitary jails we have. This is pretty rough place. And Joseph interprets the dreams that Pharaoh's having. And if you remember the story, the dreams are, here in Egypt, you're going to have 7 years of plenty. And then you're going to have 7 years of famine. So right now, start storing up. Don't eat every bit of grain that comes in. Don't spend everything. Store up so when those 7 years of famine come, you can survive that time. This pleased Pharaoh quite a bit. He put Joseph as second in command over all of Egypt. So he went from prisoner to just under Pharaoh, just as a matter, just in a moment. So he's in charge of storing up this food for this upcoming famine. So that's happening down in Egypt. So meanwhile, the famine comes back up in Canaan. This famine hits not only Egypt, but it hits Canaan as well. And so Jacob sends his sons, those sons that sold brothers into slavery, sends them down to Egypt to buy grain. Similar to what we read earlier about Abraham and Sarah. Long story short, now this is Genesis chapter 42 through 50 in a nutshell, okay? The brothers go down to Joseph, or they go before Joseph to buy grain, and Joseph, of course, recognizes them, but the brothers don't recognize Joseph. And so out of a lot of back and forth, Joseph tells the brothers who he is. And that's where we are in Genesis chapter 45, the first 8 verses here. It says, "Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all of his attendants, and he cried out, 'Have everyone leave my presence.' So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living?' But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, 'Come close to me.' And when they had done so, he said, 'I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there's been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing, no reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and all of Egypt.'" Now, if Joseph had been a bitter, vindictive person, I know I couldn't have blamed him. You know, he come from this long line of liars and cheats, sold into slavery by his own family, has wrongful charges brought against him, sits in prison for years for something he didn't even do. But instead of being bitter, he recognized that God orchestrated his life so that he would be in this position when his family needed him, he would be there. So let's listen to some of those last words that are recorded about Joseph. It's in Genesis chapter 50, verses 15 through 21. It says, "When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, 'What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?' So they sent word to Joseph saying, 'Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you're to say to Joseph. I will ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they've committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of our father.' And when their message came to him, Joseph wept. And his brothers came and threw themselves down before him. 'We are your slaves,' they said. But Joseph said to them, 'Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended for it for good, to accomplish what now is being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children.' And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them." Let's look at that chart in your bulletin again. So in that same generation as Joseph's brothers, we have Joseph. And what did he do? He forgave, and he broke that cycle that has been handed down for generations. And the reason he did that is because he saw God's hand. He had a relationship with God, and he saw God's hand in his life. So that's a nice Bible story of 38 chapters in the book of Genesis, isn't it? But what does that have to do with us? What does that have to do with you and me in the 21st century? Here's the thing. God can use you no matter who you are, what you've done. In fact, your past doesn't have to dictate or sabotage your future. So we can see this in two perspectives. We can see this from the perspective of the perpetrators and the victims. All right, so on the perpetrator side, we've got Abraham. He's the guy that started. Now, we don't know about his past. It may have gone on for generations before. But he starts this multi-generational dysfunction. But he's known as the father of the Jewish people. In fact, James 2:23 calls Abraham a friend of God. Isaac, he's called a child of the promise. Jacob, God renames him to Israel, and the names of his sons become the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. When God speaks to Moses in the book of Exodus, many, many times God refers to himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So it's one thing for a human to recognize God and say, I'm a Christian, I'm a God follower, I'm a Jesus follower. It's another thing if God recognizes the person and identifies with them. So you got God identifying, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But we know their story. We know they're a bunch of cheats and liars. God identifies with them. Also, these three are listed in chapter 11 of Hebrews. That's what we call our Hall of Faith. That's that chapter dedicated to those Old Testament heroes that exhibited great faith. And even though a lot of them were liars and cheaters, God used them in great ways. So here's the point. Just because you've contributed to your dysfunctional family, God can still use you. He used Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. He still used these guys. But what about from the victim's point of view? Let's look at this from Joseph's point of view. See, he used his adversity, his dysfunctional family experience, not to become bitter, but to become better. Centuries before it was written, Joseph understood this principle that's found in Romans 8:28. It says, for we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. So the point here, looking at it from the victim's point of view, is just because you come from a dysfunctional family, God can still use your pain for the good of others and for his kingdom. Now, earlier in the service, I mentioned Miss Julie Poss, Julie Gladden now. She didn't come from an ideal home life. In fact, she's going to talk a little bit about that. I've asked her to share her story, and so we've got a video that she recorded because she wasn't able to be here. So watch this, would you?
Hi, my name is Julie Gladden. I'm 24 years old, and I grew up in Whitehall, Arkansas. My family was pretty dysfunctional growing up. Our life was constantly plagued with pretty much drugs and alcohol, anything around that line of substance abuse. My mother was a drug addict for as long as I can remember. My older sister also got into it. My mother actually went to prison for it for several years, and my dad ended up leaving us at that time, and we ended up with our grandmother. So it's been it was a really crazy childhood. And this childhood was all that I knew. When you grow up in the Bible Belt, you sometimes take for granted, everybody knows what Christianity is. Everybody knows what Jesus, stands for, or what the cross stands for. I didn't grow up in church. I genuinely knew none of that. Like, you could have asked me who Jesus was, and I could have been like, I wouldn't have known. I wouldn't have been able to tell you. I wouldn't have been able to tell you what the cross stood for or referenced. I had no idea. I didn't know what the difference between, Baptist or a Catholic. I had no idea. So when I was probably about 14, my friend invited me to come to one of those flag football youth events with her for the student ministry. So I ended up going, and it was like an immediate difference of feeling for me. Like, I instantly knew that it was different. The flag football, that was great and everything, and we ended up going to the student ministry later, and they talked about who Jesus was, and that he had died for our sins, and I had never heard any of this before, so it was somewhat mind-blowing for me to hear that, hey, you have a God that loves you, like genuinely loves you, and he died for you. And it just blew me away immediately, and I knew that it was real, and that that message had been for me that day. And it changed my life. When you are in a situation that you've grown up in. A lot of times, those children end up following in the footsteps that their parents led for them. My sister, my older sister, being one of those, she ended up getting into drugs like my mother, and she ended up passing away at the age of 22 from a drug overdose. And it's so easy to fall into those familial patterns. It would have been easy to follow into my family's footsteps, to continue on in that life of chaos. But as soon as I found out who Jesus was, and that he loved me, and that he had a plan for my life that didn't include any of the things I was currently going through to be my future, it was a game changer, and it still is. So for those of you who don't know me personally from my time when First Baptist was my home church, I ended up going to college at University of Arkansas at Monticello, and got my degree in Bachelor of Arts in Music. I am currently the head band director of a 5A band program in Hope, Arkansas. Running about 360 kids, and the things that I grew up with have really actually God has used in so many ways. I can really connect with my students that have gone through similar struggles. I know what it was like to grow up in poverty. I know what it was like to grow up with a parent addicted to substances. I know what it's like to have parents that weren't around, and I can connect with those kids. So it's, in a lot of ways, it's been a blessing. But God can use anything for his kingdom and for good. I'm married now, and I have a sweet little 4-year-old girl. And I'm really blessed. God has worked in my life in about a million different ways, and he's still working in my life today. He's always. So thank you, and hope to come visit you guys soon.
Wow, that's pretty powerful, isn't it? What Julie didn't tell you is that her great-grandmother that started the wrong name, she was a prostitute and addicted to substances way back when. Now, here's the thing. Julie gave her little girl, Annie, the middle name Joanne, but put 2 N's on it. So she quit that cycle as well. She decided she would be the one to stop the cycle of dysfunction in her family. So here's the bottom line of the whole message. Jesus isn't afraid of your family at all. He works through ordinary folks from ordinary families full of chaos and pain and failure, has forever. He loves us and offers us healing in the midst of our foolishness. Great news is that God loves you even before you get your act together, all right? No matter how crazy your life is or your family tree is, God said in so many words, I want to use you. I want you to be part of my plan for healing and for peace. And your history of pain and chaos can actually help others find peace and healing. And just like Julie said, God can use your painful past, and he can use it to help others. But like Julie and like Joseph, the choice actually is yours, what to do. Be bitter about the past or let God use your past to become better. Pray with me.